that you're skipping your homework. You're skipping your reference homework, you're skipping your tooling homework, you're skipping your genre homework, you're skipping your calibration homework, and you're like putting yourself in this position where it's pretty all or nothing. One of the most expensive things you can do in all of game development is let your designers advance, phases into scaled production phases on components that work well, but they don't understand. And you will wake up one day and realize that you can't pivot them. That's profoundly optimistic that you think that your audience is going to be giving you crisp feedback.
How do you know if your game will engage players? Besides early playtesting, what can help you commit to a path for what you're developing? And why is it so hard to make those early calls? Let's say you've settled on an idea for your game, and you've been hard at work trying to figure it out. You realize that players will be the ultimate arbiter of whether your game will succeed or not. But what are the other ways you can understand if you've got something good on your hands? Leif Johansen is a designer who has worked on many FPS titles, including Destiny and Call of Duty. He can't guarantee you success, but he is going to help you understand both the approach and some techniques to increase your odds of settling on a game that will actually work for players. Leif, it's great to talk to you. We talk a lot, and I'm always excited to do so. But how are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I think it's 2024 definitely had some dark bits with industry and game development, but also, man, there's so many good games. Talking to a lot of peers that are sort of excited about what they're doing or interesting projects. I think there's always sort of that game that sort of impresses you, that makes you want to get back in there and sort of make something awesome. So I don't know. It's both bitter and sweet.
So I answered a question that someone asked about, hey, how do you know your game is going in the right direction? How do you know your game's going to be good? And I pointed to, make contact with reality as rapidly as you can, get your game in front of players, play test it yourself, whatever you can do. And I stand by that answer, but you were like, yep, it's a good producer answer, Ben. And I want to add some depth to that. I want to add some color. I think earlier we said, I want to make that black box a little bit more gray for people. And that sounds really awesome to me. And so I got a series of questions I want to run through that are kind of focused in on this space. And I'm going to start really, really broad, because you just talked about where you started in your career, where you've gone to. You've been doing this a while. What are the common mistakes that you see when people kick off a new game?
Yeah, I think the mistake that I see probably the most often is we're going to develop a pitch, and then we're going to see how to, on the cheap, build a really slim version of that pitch to solicit feedback against. And the more narrow and careful we can get, that's sort of really, it's we're going to get an MVP and people are going to play it. And it's fundamentally destructive for a couple of reasons. On paper, there's some merit to that argument, but you get burned in a few different ways. First, undercooking how much homework, video game reference that you've played yourself, Twitch streamers that you've watched, how much homework you've done in the genre beyond the pitch to better inform it, to sort of better prepare yourself to be ready to adapt if you ever have to sort of adjust the pitch, if it's not catching it, all the things you need to do to sort of support, insights that you need to farm to make sure that pitch is paired with a firm understanding of kind of what you're about to sort of get into. If you have a pitch for a new smartphone and it's a really good idea, how much do you know about all the smartphones that didn't work and the features of the smartphones that sort of didn't land or did work? If you're going to be in the smartphone R&D space, really, lift weights, get strong, make sure that you're prepared for your pitch to sort of really need adjustment as you go. The second thing I see is teams are often way too quick to budget and target their tooling against a specific pitch. And they're nervous that if they don't sort of get to that pitch sooner than later, they're going to run out of money. They're like that sort of, they're going to bloat their path to it. The problem being that building, really strong technology fundamentals, genre concepts that aren't distractingly broken, and sort of just a well calibrated sort of like set of tools of investigation is what you will need to make the most of your pitch. That if you sort of put it in front of somebody and you get notes, you're not really in a good position to sort of think critically about sort of what merits further investigation, and how do you investigate it efficiently, because you just ran to get this thing in your hand to sort of see if it had merit. And often it's through the experiments and the genre fundamentals that you actually get in the right mindset to interpret the audience feedback itself. That you've done the work around the prototype, so you kind of have a better ear for sort of what the audience is saying about the thing that you think probably works. On top of that, I'm pretty big on, don't do the hard, high stakes pitch prototype too soon in your prototyping plan, because you are going to have a bunch of like emotional stakes and bias, and it's going to feel very heavy in a way that's going to distract from what you should be doing, which is taking on a much easier, much more simple derivative set of prototypes, just to make sure that your genre fundamentals, your team are all well calibrated to do harder proving and exploration. That you're trying to sort of do the Olympic bar right out of the gate and seeing how fast you can lift it. You got to sort of get a couple practice reps to calibrate that sort of there's not noise in your system, that not to say the word science too much, because I feel like it gets pretentious if you say too much. But like, if you're going to be scientific, building a control experiment, which like when you execute it tells you that your team is ready for tougher questions, your tools are ready, your tech's ready, like making sure that you're calibrating your team and your tools and your tech before you take on the lift of sort of giving your pitch an honest shot is critical to make sure you're in a position to make the most of it. So it's like, it might seem roundabout that you're like, well, we're going to sell everyone this magic pitch, and it's exciting, and we're just so hyped to do it, and we're going to sort of be good producers and good business folk and make sure that we don't have a lot of fat, we don't have a lot of waste, we're going to be focused. But like, you're building a like a machine that knows how to sort of like ask questions and get fuzzy answers efficiently. And when you go back to when you go to that audience to get that validation to sort of see where you're actually at, you're going to be right back in the lab the next day going, okay, so are we committing to this? Is it really validated? Are there elements of it that are working, that are not working? Like, it's just very binary. It's like, we got validation or we didn't. And it's like, that's profoundly optimistic that you think that your audience is going to be giving you crisp feedback on a build that has, intentionally half-baked genre concepts, that has a bunch of jank that you have to apologize for with cause, and that like you're going to sort of hear the golden notes that everything's great, everything's fun, and now we can just proceed. But like, I think it's easy to fall into that trap, because the more you talk about your pitch, the more you get people excited about your pitch, the team's jazzed to get after the pitch and sort of really prove it in a way that's playable and inspiring. But it's often in that pursuit that you're skipping your homework, you're skipping your reference homework, you're skipping your tooling homework, you're skipping your genre homework, you're skipping your calibration homework, and you're like putting yourself in this position where it's pretty all or nothing. Like, you better be right, because if it's anything less than right, like, are you going to do it all again? We're gonna pivot wildly, build an entirely new pitch, do that dance all over again. You could spend years trying to do high stakes, waterfalled, mega builds, trying to get just enough audience validation that you get thumbs up. And I feel like it's a losing game. Like, it's just like, I think that I like a lot of the good intentions of sort of pursuing audience validation and sort of MVP aggressively, but you really, there's always that little bit in there that's sort of like, okay, but are we ready? Did we do the work?
Yeah. No, I when I'm hearing this, it's funny. There's these like competing ideas bouncing around my head, because I've often been somebody who said something like, well, okay, like, pare it down, get something basic out and all that. But I really appreciate what you're saying in that the word questions kept coming to mind. It's like there's at this stage there's a ton of questions, and those questions aren't just what's the game, it's what's the space, what's the player, what's the competition, what does good look like. I love how you brought up the smartphone example. Like, why did these phones fail? Why did these phones succeed? Do you know that in your space? Have you gone and looked? Because if you rush ahead and you get a 45-minute playtest session with 40 players or something set up. Okay, well, after 45 minutes, they all said, yeah, that was kind of fun. What does that mean?
Yes.
And if you don't have that background and you aren't, the thing, more so even than the word science, it was like you become a student of the genre, the space that you're trying to enter, the player that's there. Because some people say, well, I'm trying to make a totally new genre. Well, cool. Find the closest things around it and try to because there's something where you want to be that student who's watching and observing and paying attention. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people, like in my mind, I was like, how would I argue against this, right? If I was like, no, you just want to get it out there. You just build the prototype fast and launch it. And I actually think in some circumstances that might be the right move. But what I would say is like, I would say I tried to use the agile thing of like working software over comprehensive documentation, right? Like one of the core pillars, core value. No, we're trying to be agile. We want working software over comprehensive documentation. And when I see that, I go, yeah, we're not, what you're talking about isn't necessarily comprehensive documentation. It's actually investment of and what's the word, like it's living in the world that you want your game to go into.
Yeah,
it's this deep understanding.
I love Riot's development framework documentation, and like one of the really interesting subtle lines that are in there is for prototype to end, you need to sort of like prove you got something. You have to have audience validated that's playable, correct? But the other piece underneath it is the development team's own grasp as to sort of why that's meaningful and what it is. And to get that meaningful grasp is different in video games than it is in almost any other medium, because the rest of the project is going to have multiple opportunities to either bend or change that component or a set of components that got you that audience validation. It's going to sort of test your knowledge as to sort of what makes them tick. And like one of the most expensive things you can do in all of game development is let your designers advance, phases into scaled production phases on components that work well, but they don't understand. And you will wake up one day and realize that you can't pivot them, or you pivot them badly, that you can't iterate upon them. And it's often the prototypes that failed adjacent to the ones that worked that sort of yield the most understanding as to why the prototype that you chose to get audience validation against was smart. And when you get that information from the audience, ideally, your designers like that totally turns on a light. I know what that means. I'm pretty like they can commit to it and canonize it in documentation form or however you do it by being really crisp with the rest of the team. This is the fundamental reason this prototype landed with this audience. I don't know everything, but I can tell you, I'm pretty sure this is sacred and this thing that we need to remember throughout the rest of the project. And you can very easily lose that, since it's often game teams that sort of for a technology reason or a scaling reason, like put that lesson to the test. And the number of times like a lone senior lead designer stuck up a hand and say, guys, remember when we were prototyping and we realized that X is important? And everyone's like, oh, that's right, we can't do that. Like you're, the one of my favorite prototyping, if not my favorite prototyping GDC talk is the Action Blocks Titanfall 2 talk. I think it's Chris Dion, where they talked about how they built a machine for Titanfall 2 where they had one designer developing one prototype within constraints, I think every 3 to 7 days. And that it was only evaluated as a set. Individual prototypes were not that high stakes because they weren't trying to sort of draw profound lessons from one prototype that often. Once they had 40, they looked at the set and sort of squinted and sort of thought about what type of like box does that give for sort of what Titanfall 2 campaign is. Like what is the shape it's allowed to occupy within? Validate that. If you think if you look at 40 prototypes and you think you come to conclusions and that's what you're bringing to an audience validation test for a Titanfall 2 campaign, $5, your designers are ready to commit, ready to sort of really say, we think we understand what this is, and we're ready to sort of like start building proper shippable missions. For me, that's the dream, but you get that from prototyping as a set, not a smaller number of higher stake prototypes, which is where I feel like teams go wrong. They're like, no, we're going to spend 3 months on this one build, and that one build is going to like
Yeah.
do the thing. And I'm like, dude, you will not be in a position to make the most of it because you don't have the broader pattern, and you don't have dead prototypes that are sort of telling you where the boundaries are and where the lessons are.
Yeah.
Like, one of my biggest prototyping lessons is very often the best prototypes are not good. They're provocative. They create debate within your team as to what the boundaries are and what's happening and what's working. And you have people that have passionate feelings that this is the future and this is exactly the heart of the IP. And have other people saying it's like death and should be avoided and that we need to remove it. That's where you actually get the lessons and commitment, even if it's controversial, to proceed into another project phase. And you're in a position to make the most of your audience validation. Without that, I just feel like the audience validation, like, it'll help. It's not bad, but your team is still at a loss as to sort of their grasp of sort of what even works and why.
Oh man, I want to get into maybe jump down a layer into some of the practically, and then so when okay, you've been doing this a lot in the last few years. What are you trying to achieve when you lead a team through that early ideation? Then, like, this is the goal state that I have.
I think this might surprise you as a producer, but like
Surprise me.
I've slowly drifted towards confidence in the team's ability to ask good questions and answer them efficiently, like demonstrating that capacity, having good conversations about how we do it. What are, where's the ways to improve it? Are we having too many meetings? Are we having too few meetings? Are we picking tech heavy prototypes? Are we taking on too much tech debt? Like, are we really operating as a high performing team and getting after just good exploration R&D questions? And is it sort of like, are we having the right debates? Are we really digging in? That matters to me more than the raw creative, as to sort of like, are we really racking up points against our thesis? Like, are we like, if we spend the first chunk of the project really doing the work to feel we're confident to develop hypotheses that are worthy of building a lab around and building prototypes to sort of investigate. Like, if we're past that phase and we did the homework, we're ready to build a lab. And we build a genre lab and we're like, man, this is a strong genre lab, and we've validated that this lab can ask good questions in this space because our genre Legos are good enough and we have enough sort of engineering capacity to support it. Now we can really get off of prototyping. I'm more worried that we're sort of like, did we really prove to ourselves that we're good at prototyping? Then are the prototypes bearing enough fruit? Because I'm confident if you build the team that's capable of doing awesome prototyping and you get after it hard enough, you'll get there. Like, like you might have to go back to your reference and reevaluate, relook at your hypotheses. You might, be sad that you undercooked some of your genre Legos and you need to sort of buff them up. But if you build that right, I think your team's pretty positioned for success. And now you can do what I think the Respawn GDC talk sort of implies, which is start building sort of a patchwork of, breadth of prototypes to start recognizing patterns and sort of like have a different conversation with your team, which is sort of like, hey, it's time to start really, making hard decisions based off of our prototype learnings. Like, do we feel like our prototypes are telling us a story? Like, we have all these little song snippets. What's the album? And sometimes they're like, I don't know, maybe we just need more R&D. And you're like, okay, but like, let's be disciplined and make sure that we're committing and that we're not just, hitting diminishing returns on sort of lessons. But on the flip, let's also be honest with ourselves that like, we do need to like fall in love with our favorite prototypes slower. Like, one of the things that blew my mind about that Respawn GDC talk is most their prototypes did not directly become missions or get pulled in directly. Some of them did, but a lot of them were just there to sort of like live as lessons for future devs looking for what might work. So it's like you're almost building up a library of learnings that you're not entirely sure when they'll bear fruit, but you're confident that you have a good enough library to move forward. And that gives you the confidence to start pushing for audience validation, pushing for hey, let's tell engineering this is real and stop messing around. But I think often you need a design team that's pretty mature that sort of knows when to start winding down, but also sort of like knows how not to get rattled. Like it's really easy to get lost in that jungle if you're not careful. But focusing on sort of your team situational awareness and their capacity to sort of really get after the thing, I think bears more fruit than trying to have the perfect prototyping plan or the magic pitch that's going to sort of bear fruit immediately because it's such a good idea. I'm just like, dude, like it happens. Sometimes you're lucky, but the capabilities of your team is often sort of the real thing that saves your bacon and really sort of secures your ability to make the most of those learnings. Like, so one of the worst things that can happen to a team is their first couple of prototypes are way too good, and the team's like, I guess we slayed the dragon. And you're like, oh God, like now we're gonna walk into the next phase with sort of weaker muscles, and like you're like, well, you're not wrong. This is probably the thing. We should probably commit to it, but we didn't get the benefit of like dead prototypes acting as fertilizer to sort of better inform the one that we settled on.
Man, there's a okay. So I said in the first part that there is a focus on questions. By the way, as a producer, I'm kind of a weird as a producer though. But like what you just said did not surprise me at all. I loved it because what you basically said, like the first part, you talked a lot about questions, and it's like, hey, look, I'm going to immerse myself in a space and see if I can answer questions around this space, and then I'm going to build muscles around the space of answering questions, rather than trying to get one good prototype out and then having some people play it. And if they give me above an 8 out of 10, then we keep going. And if they give me below a 6 out of 10, then we pivot or like whatever. Something that is a lot more arbitrary. It's like, no, go and practice. It's like, you've used several analogies to like gyms and workouts. I want you to go into that space and I want you to start pushing and practicing and experimenting and trying. And so that starting, and then as that relates to the team, the thing I heard, so correct me if I'm wrong, I want my team to be able to continue that curious questioning collaboratively so that we get better and better at it's not like, I think it's this thing of the value versus the stuff side. I don't want you to get better at building stuff necessarily. I mean, yes, you will, and that's good. But actually what I want you to get better at is understanding the stuff you've built and why it did or did not work.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking for me because a lot of developers, I didn't realize that their happiness in life, their intrinsic motivation is shippable content. It is like the thing that they love to do is to put their time towards things that are going to go in the box or shippable processes that like people love or many people love just feeling like you're racking up wins, and often prioritizing learnings or prioritizing homework or prioritizing the quality of the lab feels like you're robbing time and effort from what could be going towards shippable content. And part of that's, ties into the thing that we spoke about earlier, which is like, if you hang out on sort of franchise games or you spend most of your time in production and post-production, like you internalize that like you're supposed to be racking up, shippable content at a certain pace and
get it done, get it done, get it done, get it
yeah,
done.
and
Yep.
I think it's not just, producers, it's artists, it's designers, and it's, if you're asking me, sort of like, big mistakes of these phases is often like there's a misunderstanding of sort of what the goalposts are. And it's like, hey, like our goalpost for this particular subphase is to get our lab in a fighting shape to make prototyping awesome. And you're like, well, how does that impact the artists? I'm like, do you know how hard it is to sort of get artists to build a pipeline, to build proxy animation, VFX, audio that's sort of efficient, but sort of unappealing at the same time that they're sort of trying to get, do their own R&D and get accommodated or get acclimated to the project. It's hard because those guys are there because they want to swing for the fences, and getting them to sort of like, design is going to ask for art that is excessively polished because it's going to make their prototypes hit harder, not realizing the indirect cost that's our new bar for all our prototyping sort of, proxy asset support. It's like, dude, you're creating a sort of throwaway tax on sort of all our stuff. This is getting in the way of our goal of sort of more efficiently arriving at learnings. But to a certain degree, the learnings are just being harvested to turn into the core DNA of the game and content best practices. And often For me, vertical slice is often the latter. It's where you're really cementing your content best practices. And first playable, late first playable is really you're cementing the sort of core DNA of the game, and the like getting people to understand that often sort of quantity of exploration is more important than quality of exploration is like deeply unintuitive because they're in a quality mindset. They're like, I'm just going to make the one magic prototype that settles all the questions. And you're like, no, 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 no. Prioritize speed. We need five prototypes that are all puzzle pieces around this questions faster and more efficiently, not one prototype that you're going to kill the dragon with one swing of the sword. And it's in some ways inverted to sort of what it is to be in production. Because in production, we want them being
Yep.
like, yeah, kill it the first way, the right way, do it like, go for it. Here it's like, nah, man, like if you're trying to just do that magical swing, it'll actually end up hurting more than helps because we learn more from sort of like intelligent fast failure around a problem than in trying to sort of really devise the perfect solution that's going to give us the magic learnings that's going to get us to feel confident in pulling the trigger on core DNA for the game or sort of a new content best practice.
I hear you describing essentially the process for how do I build a studio that is a learning machine. And if I can create a studio that is an effective learning machine, then I have a much higher confidence that they will be able to create a game down the road. And so that's what I focus on when I start off with ideation. I'm like, let's immerse ourselves in this space. Let's learn. And lots of people would say, "Oh, your first prototype, throw it away," and all this different stuff. But you're going, it's like you're deeper. It's like no, there's you don't throw it away because you need to pivot. You throw it away because it helped you understand the space. You pulled those learnings, and now you're going to make another 10 different small
Yeah,
prototypes, and you're going to learn. You're going to keep doing that until you feel like you're able to make a good guess when you build something about what's going to happen. And when that starts kind of like clicking in, it's like, okay, we're reaching that point of immersion in the space. We're reaching the point of we've been a student of the space we're trying to go into, the player, the genre, whatever it is. Now, now perhaps we have sufficient answers to actually make a call.
yeah, you're building a map, and it's a crappy map that it has like some parts that don't totally make sense, but the prototypes, all the exploration, sort of like point to a shape of a map that you can use to make hard decisions. More importantly, they would what gives you the confidence that even with audience validation, you're ready to proceed with it because you have a decent map that you can sort of leverage when inevitably you get stuck in a year when your content standards aren't quite working or the core DNA of your game starts misfiring. You remember sort of the lessons that sort of like kind of how to debug them and sort of like, oh, that's right, we learned why. And I think people underestimate sort of like how much speed matters. Like when you're trying to build a map, like you just, like those quick snapshots, those dirty snapshots of different pieces of the map, it's going to be like if you aren't moving quick, it's just going to be overwhelming because you'll just never get around to sort of getting enough pieces of the map that you can squint at it and sort of figure out what it's trying to tell you. And often what feels like being efficient by sort of doing, investigation of one little piece of the map, doing it a little bit slower but better. I'm just like, dude, you're killing us. We need to be really getting after this map to have any chance of sort of like piecing it together in time. Otherwise, we're going to be going back to the business, being like, we need more money to do more investigation. And they're like, what have you learned? And we're like, we've learned it's definitely not these three things. These three things don't work. We need budget for three more things. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work, man. Like, the faster, more like impartial knowledge is just a more efficient path there. But typically what ends up happening is like producers back off and say like, well, I'm going to give the creator space to do their exploration. And that's me being a good producer. And I'm just like, eh. And the creatives often nest that if they'll find one little area of the map that sort of has some really interesting pieces or they're sort of like prematurely polishing it and they lose, they arrive at diminishing returns with regards to map making much faster than you think.
You mentioned this earlier, I think. It's so easy to become emotionally invested and precious about the things we're making. And what you're suggesting also just pushes so strongly against that.
Yeah.
It's like, no. Like, just build it. Okay, build it. Great. We did. It's not even about what we learned about this. Again, it's about what we learned about the space. It's about how this helped us understand the map as you're describing it. Get on to the next part.
Yeah.
Get on to the next part. Get on to the next part. Like, do not become attached to that,
So I'm gonna
because
like
we'll chuck
like
it.
imagine this, like you're a chef and you're trying to like work on a riff on a dessert that exists, but you're trying to change it fundamentally. Like you could try to like plan to build the perfect version of that new dessert, exactly what it is, and put it in front of people and have them eat it and tell you, they'll tell you if it's the thing that you hope to be or not quite. Or like you could start working on that dessert, work with people to sort of intentionally put too much salt. So now you know the boundary for salt. Put too much sugar, now you know the boundary for sugar. Too much ketchup, now you know the boundary for ketchup. You're mapping what happens if you cook it wrong, but you're also learning intrinsically what it is by sort of understanding what breaks it. By setting a variable too far in one direction or another, it's a more efficient way to map the space. And you might get lucky and your magic dessert that you tried to one shot works and you're good. And you might be laughing at the people that are like, dude, why would you intentionally put too much salt? And it's like, that's because we need to understand the relationship salt has with this dish. And that's literally what I do as a designer prototyping. People are like, oh, this prototype isn't that good. People are scared to tell me, like, I don't think this prototype's fun. I'm like, it shouldn't be fun. I broke it. I made shotguns too hot, or I made movement too quick. And that it's so much faster to sort of like
Yeah.
understand a boundary by crossing a boundary than to try to iterate in small increments towards the boundary until you cross it ever so slowly. It's like
There's yeah. There's a guy I worked with. Great. He's also in the design space with a really good product sense. And he said something very similar. He was applying it into the live space, but he said like during development, I mean, it sounded like he uses this all the time. And it was when you feel like the balance is off, everybody's trying to figure out like, well, does it need to go up by 5%, by 10%? He's like, double it.
double it. Yeah.
Cut it in half. Like just do something dramatic and see what happens. And this is like it so resonates with what you're describing as the provocative. Like you're trying not to create the best prototype because you don't know what best is yet. You try to create the provocative prototype because you will start learning the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable. And in his own way, I think that was like that same thing of, yeah, dude, like, oh, is it too weak? Okay, cool. I'm just gonna 10x it. Well, it's way too strong now. Okay, good.
So
Cool. Like I'll
I completely agree. It's just to be clear, this applies to other crafts. When concept art
Yeah.
is trying to pursue key art, them going intentionally too dark, intentionally too colorful, like intentionally bad character proportions, you start discovering boundaries and rules that inform your best practices in ways that you wouldn't expect. If concept art is just trying to sort of like only draw bangers all the time, every time, you get false confidence that you have something really compelling that you don't really understand. And I honestly feel this similarly about producers. I think it's healthy for producers in pre-production to be like, we're going to shrink the stand-up in half or double it or tweak the format. Like it's just producers are often hesitant because they're worried about sort of whiplashing their devs, but producers have to sort of develop processes in similar fashion as designers have to do with prototypes. And I often see a similar pattern, which is sort of like you're trying to get it in one swing. And what you really want to do is to sort of understand, the variables in greater depth. So when they misbehave, you have greater insight and intuition as to sort of what probably is going wrong. Like you're going to need that in the final year of development in ways you don't even understand. Like when now you've got like deadlines that are hitting you twice as hard as they were in pre-production, and you don't have time to sort of run experiments or like, a lot of the last year of production is a knowledge chest of whatever you learned in the first year of development.
Yeah, there's something to speak to my own experience in this as a producer. I've often said that as I got more experienced as a producer, it wasn't that my hit rate went up, although it probably did because I learned some new tools and I like I said, I understood the space more. There were things that improved, but it was that I was way more comfortable than when whatever I tried didn't work, and I was way more comfortable trying wild swings at things. And I would just, and like in some of my later teams that I worked on, it would just be like, oh, we're trying to solve that. Oh, that's a weird sort of either dependency issue or something with us and the other team. Well, let's try this. And people were like, that might work. And I'm like, okay, let's try it. And we try it, and it would totally not work. It would just be a disaster. And I'd be like, whatever, didn't work. Let's try this instead. And they're like, okay. And once the team realizes that like you don't have to succeed every time as a producer, and once you realize you don't have to succeed every time as a producer, and that you have to iterate to some extent, but not like don't do a million little tweaks to the retro type thing. Like take some big swings at stuff, because the retro is there to drive continuous improvement. If it's not working, are there other ways you can get continuous improvement? Like what's going wrong? Like take some shots and be comfortable if they fail. Just going like, that didn't work. Everybody, we're going to stop doing it.
I completely agree. I will caveat though that people tend to have unexpected biases as to which crafts are allowed to do exploration. And it varies
per
it varies per tradition. Like some people feel that engineers have no room to run experiments. Some people feel like producers have no room to run experiments. And some people feel like there's no design. They're like, you're a designer. You should just know it works. And you're like, that's like, no, dude.
Aren't you a good designer? Come on.
But you have to understand, like often it's because they're blocked or they have genuine project anxiety. They're like, well, if design doesn't have answers within the next weeks, we're in a lot of trouble. And the subtext is like, you guys need to just pick something. And, if conditions are harsh enough, there might be some merit there. But often it's just like, well, we're running right back into the same problem that like, if I pick something, but I don't understand it, we're just delaying the day for me to have to take the time to figure out sort of it might be more expensive in the long run for me to find out in production as to the consequences of that choice than in prototyping. So it's like, dude, it's not just a component, it's plug and play, man. You're like, inevitably somebody on the team has to sort of know or have a good intuition to sort of like how that component will behave in different circumstances, or like how that best practice might need to evolve at scale. Like I said, the knowledge test is very real. And I think people underestimate how well they need to understand their own game DNA and content best practices, or team dynamics or team processes that require, like, there's a reason why we do this, and we decided never to write it down, and we had one person that was Mr. or Miss Tribal Knowledge, and it's just like, oh no, we spent the years to get this knowledge, and it sort of like wobbles in our hand just when we need it. Just like, happens a lot.
So if you've been the game director, project lead, design director, these sorts of things, what does it look like when you get towards the end of prototyping? Like what are you seeing come together or not come together? Like what does that look like? Hey, I think I've got it. What's it?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty dense topic, so I'm gonna have to sort of like pick carefully.
Yeah, no, take your time.
I think there's, depending on the genre, there's the core and counter loop. Like, hey, most video games are puzzle solving. What tools do I have to solve a puzzle? What's the variety of puzzles? Is this working? Like, if I'm making Portal, I have a Portal gun, and what's a Portal puzzle? And I think often devs sort of don't spend enough time really looking at sort of the pairing of sort of, are these the right puzzle solving tools, and are these the right puzzles, and being really sort of narrow as to sort of like, what's your hypertypical puzzle? What's your hypertypical tool? And like, is this pairing working? And looking deep at your audience, looking deep at your reference, and basically being like, this feels healthy. And often that's a mix of really leveraging your reference for sort of like tried and true elements where you don't reinvent the wheel, but also, I think Wright calls it proprietary mastery, that like your game should have some concept of needing to learn something new or adapt that feels IP specific, and figuring out what the right proprietary mastery is and how much of it, and sort of like squinting to see if it's likely to sort of speak to the audience, because it's like, well, my audience wishes they had a little more complexity. It's like, we're gonna layer on a little more complexity. Like let's see if this hits, if this is a flavor that people like. I think it's incredibly difficult because building like a successful core loop that feels very strong is almost like Tony Stark in the cave, where you're just like, well, it's a bunch of parts and a bunch of ideas and a bunch of components, and it's like often they just don't coalesce. It's like there's something about these encounters where there's the relationship between the encounters and the tools to solve the encounters don't really feel like they have a good chemistry with each other. And often it's some of your most difficult prototyping, but often teams try to delay it. My advice is like, don't delay it. You really, really, really want to dig into your core encounters and your core verbs to solve questions. And if you feel like you don't totally understand them, like that's definitely a spot where you're going to get tested 1,200 times in production. So for example, like playstyle diversity. Playstyle diversity in a lot of ways is just different flavors of verbs to help solve puzzles. It's like my place.
Can you talk to me more about verbs? Talk to me more about verbs.
Yeah,
What
verbs
do
is
you mean
basically like things that your avatar can do to advance, like shooting, moving, jumping, and their relationship with each other. And if if you're tweaking the relationship between those verbs, it is really easy to run into lessons as to sort of why the rest of the genre does something one way or not. And like on one hand, it's like one of the hardest places to innovate, but it's also one of the spots where it's the most important to innovate because your game can't just literally play like another game. And the thing that's sort of deceptively important about it is if you don't understand your verbs and sort of your rough subset of your encounters, at least the hypertypical ones, you're just going to die. Because if you try to prototype other concepts, I mean, some genres are an exception to this, but like if you start moving forward and you don't understand that your game involves a portal gun and that it works a certain way and you use that gun to solve problems, and here's how, like if you don't understand that, you're painfully blocking so many other downstream questions and even minor ambiguity as to sort of what your combat verbs are, assuming you're a combat game. You're if you undercook that, you're just going to hate yourself. So often, like, that you're narrowing it when I guess the right way to call this is the choreography starts clicking, that suddenly people start using your verbs in interesting ways that feel in line with sort of like the pillars and themes that are in your pitch, that there's like the game starts sort of like clicking in a way that you feel like, hey, there's something about these encounters, and you comparing them apples to apples with sort of your reference encounters. It's going to teach you a lot about kind of what really makes your game tick. And like a Halo encounter is not a Call of Duty encounter, is not a Titanfall encounter. Like to discover and refine that DNA, you need to have a really strong grasp of what's working. But it's also sort of like making sure that you're not just going on a wild fishing expedition where you're just, like adding things on top of those concepts, seeing if something special happens. That's like destructive. Like really looking at your prototypes, connecting the dots as to actually when we make movement too fast, it really trivializes position. Or when we make it too slow, it really hurts the player fantasy because there's something about moving fast that makes them feel immersed. And like you're discovering those boundaries for each of those variables and how they hit each other. It's like cooking food, man. Like just you're not quite sure how all the flavors combine, so you just need to get in there and dig. But it's some of the sort of purest and most challenging R&D. But once you narrow it, you knock out that pen and you sit down with the team and really sort of have a hard conversation about like, maybe we toss 2 or 3 more prototypes at sort of questions here, or is this stuff that we could sort of now that we have a strong grasp of what this is, do we really need more prototypes in this moment in time to advance our understanding of this? Or can we put a pin on it and say we've developed it enough, we have a strong enough grasp of what this is, let's move on to something that's not this line of prototyping? Some of that's emergent, but some of that's just being disciplined and making sure that your team understands that you have a limited number of prototypes to fire. And if they're not bearing fruit, that we need to pull the red cord and have conversations with production and business. But like if like the clues that you're getting, you're going to hear it in your playtests. If you have a team, even the non-designers are going to start like if you've pitched the game properly and play test it effectively, you're going to hear from the broader team that something special is happening. And the design team often needs to make sure that they're sort of capturing and committing to it in a way that feels responsible and not just nodding and saying, cool, one more good thing that we found. You're like, hold on a sec, guys. Like,
I'm gonna pick on Bungie here. I think both positively and perhaps 343, perhaps negatively. So apologies to both studios if I get this wrong. I remember when Halo was coming out, the designers, or sometime after it came out, the designers talked about these verbs, and they were like, look, you can throw a grenade, you can melee, you can shoot, and we want players regularly doing all three of those things. It doesn't mean every player that plays is going to do all of those things. Maybe someone will go through the whole map and just shoot, but broadly, we want all of these to be options that are regularly at the player's disposal. And what you see is when you see someone who knows how to play Halo going through even a very basic map, they're doing all of those things. They're shooting, they're meleeing, they're throwing grenades, and it feels very natural to the way the game plays. And there were other elements that made Halo, I think, feel like Halo. And I remember when I got to, because I'm a huge Halo fanboy going way back, but the later ones haven't been as great for me. I think it was, I was playing the Halo Infinite campaign. And no, was it 5? Maybe it was 5. Halo Infinite was the open world one, right? Yeah. Okay. Infinite was the open world. Okay, so it's Halo 5. It was one before that. I'm playing Halo 5, and I start doing the campaign, and I have a team of Spartans around me. And already that feels just incredibly weird. Like, sometimes I moved with Marines, but having other powerful Spartans, and then I got killed because I was like, what in the world? There's these Spartans around me, and I just started trying to rush through the level, and I got killed, and someone came over and revived me. And I was like, what's going on? I don't even, this is super. I think I ended up at some point after they revived me, like for the 5th time, because I started to see like, wait, does this just keep happening? And I kept putting myself in bad situations that I just threw myself off a cliff to see if that would end up, if I could actually die. Um, and that worked, I think. But there was this thing of it didn't feel right, and the verbs weren't right. Like, there was something about this that wasn't clicking. It didn't feel like a Halo experience. And as someone who'd been playing Halo since 2001 or whatever, that was it. It really rubbed me the wrong way, and it felt like, to your point around doing the homework and doing the prototypes, like, did you test this with players who liked Halo, or were you trying to hit some other audience with this or something? Because this doesn't feel right. And it's like, oh, I got like a boost and there's different things. But I also felt like, I remember playing some of those levels because I played all the way through that campaign. I almost just speed ran it once I realized how it worked. I was just like, okay, I'm just going to, hold forward on the control stick and just go for it.
Yeah.
And but it almost wasn't fun. It was almost felt like work. And there were so many times where I felt like I didn't have my tools available. Like, my melee wasn't powerful enough, or it just had to do a lot of shooting in this one. The grenades didn't seem to work. Like, there were, and it was these little subtle things where, to me, one of my conclusions was like, you didn't understand Halo before you made this. Or again, maybe you were targeting something different, and I'm the dinosaur, right? But that was the vibe I got, was like, you missed what Halo was.
I think, the easy answer is some designer didn't understand Halo, because I agree with your critique, and it's possible it was a designer. The more interesting answer to me is some producer insufficiently framed that subphase as to a time where we really needed to dig in and evaluate, does this really work? That, like,
Yeah.
if some designer basically got a bunch of kudos for stapling a thing that sort of interfered with sort of what makes it fundamentally work, like, there might have had really strong organizational incentives to basically be like, I guess I succeeded. So to better answer your previous question, like, I do think it's critical to have some concept of a lead scientist, and that the lead scientist, be it a design director or game director, you really are indirectly feeding them the prototypes to see, like, have we reached a critical mass of sort of like team grasp that we're ready to sort of commit and move forward. And historically, that's been me. And that what I do is, when the prototypes start getting novel, I start getting nervous. That's interesting, but not impactful. When the prototypes start getting too predictable, I'm pretty sure if we add sprint or speed up sprint, we're going to have this problem. I start sort of acknowledging that I'm starting to have like a pretty strong grasp of the variables. If we find that, like, we have a pretty good version of the game, and every time we sort of modify it and sort of like swing it pretty hard, it gets worse, and we just keep getting shoved back to a particular version of our game, I tend to start like preparing to wave the white flag. The thing is, like, I like reminding myself that, like, err on the side of feeling like I closed the door a little too soon as opposed to a little bit too late. because it's rare that I have a producer that does me the favor of basically being, look, man, like if you feel like you're really satisfied with your prototyping, we probably did too much prototyping. Like it's unlikely. It's unlikely that, closing the short, like the closing it, down too soon is like, it happens. But like in most cases, that's also because I've been lucky enough to have had a lot of trust that if I'm the lead scientist, people realize that if I'm starting to, people know that I tend to sort of close. I tend to sort of start shutting down prototyping when I feel that we arrive at diminishing returns. But that's a tremendously high stakes role, because if your design director loves highly novel problems, if they hate shutting down, closing doors prematurely, even if they're brilliant, often, yeah, it's going to be a struggle to sort of get them to really understand that we probably should be narrowing our prototyping and sort of like really consolidating instead of advancing. I think it takes a lot of production skill to really get the team to internalize that balance and of sort of, the cost of an additional prototype in one area versus the opportunity cost in another, and the cost of upstream still asking questions while you have downstream waiting for answers. Like, I think it's really idiosyncratic to sort of like the team and leader. But if you ask me, sort of, when I'm ready, it's like it's almost sort of like when I'm less scared. Like if you're like, hey, we're gonna advance next week, how scared are you? If I'm like terrified, I'm like, oh man, I'm not ready. But if I'm like a little scared but not that scared, it probably means we're close. But that's from sheer years, and I don't think that's necessarily the objective benchmark you want to operationalize.
Well,
But
I also want to call it too. Some of this is you probably want to have a conversation with your design director, because some might be prone to go early,
some
and
some
some might
are
be prone
some
to
are
be
risk
so.
averse. They're trying to close
Yeah,
the door too soon. That you know that they don't like the neighborhood and they're just trying to get out of it for any number of reasons, or they
yeah.
might be
Or they're
they might be
they
terrified.
could be overconfident.
Yeah,
Well, they could be. Some people could be
yeah,
overconfident, and they're just like, "Oh yeah, okay, cool. I saw a few prototypes. Yeah, I think I got a good
yeah.
grasp on
You're
this. I
right.
feel like I know what I'm doing," and they can run forward. And again, I don't mean to knock them, because they don't. It's a different problem than the designer who's, okay, do another one. Okay, do another. Hey, we've done 5,000 prototypes. Are we ready to advance yet? Right? I feel like we've gotten pretty good at predicting what's
Yeah.
going to happen.
So,
There's these two extremes on both ends, and I think as a producer, doing some amount of almost assessment of like, okay, who is the design director that I'm interacting with? Where are they on that? Can I talk with them about that? Can I like, hey, are you someone who tends to jump fast? Or are you a person who tends to like come up to the ledge a little bit slowly, then back up, then get psych yourself up, and then run up and try to make that jump? Maybe take a few shots at it or something. Like it may be helpful to understand. Do I need to pull you forward, or do I need to hold you back?
yeah.
In terms of providing a
Well,
counterweight.
well said. I mean, my last batch, one of the things that really pushed me to advance was I started hearing notes in playtest that sounded eerily close to the thesis. And like I think I had people
Mm,
that I hadn't even pitched that were like the notes were positive and were roughly in line with what I'd been selling the team for a year organically, which is unusually good. Like it's like, oh wow, that's about as good a signal as you can get. But you're often prone to miss it if you're not paying close attention to sort of your play testers, especially outside of the design team. But to your
yeah.
point, like as a producer, it is tremendously difficult to try to like figure out if you're broadening, too much or narrowing too much or too slow or too fast. And it's very team specific. You have to understand your team deeply. And often it's why I'm so protective of like once you start prototyping, it is so existential to your team. It requires so much focus. It requires so much of having your hand on the engine, knowing sort of what's doing or it's not. That distractions and juggling too many plates is really dangerous because your team might be responding to you as a leader and getting more risk averse or overly risk seeking. That's sort of like it's a really hard phase to calibrate. And in my opinion, even good design directors need perspective and need help. I like telling a story that like Guns N' Roses did not like Sweet Child of Mine and were certainly against it being the single. Like the people around them had to tell them, hey man, this is fantastic. You should put this on the album. And they're like, I guess. You mean this circus tune? Like, sure. Like it's often like when you're looking at it like all the time, Like on one hand, you have unique knowledge and intuition for what it is, but on the other hand, like it can sort of bias you as to sort of, having this like weird love-hate relationship with the prototyping, where it's one day it's the next great thing and I slayed the dragon and everyone's going to be so proud once they see it. The next day, everything we touch is terrible. I don't want to commit to any of this. And while I get that there's some like, well, we need to be patient with the creatives. That's true to a degree. Part of it's like they need your help to sort of like, find kind of like that the sort of balance within that, because prototyping, like, sometimes the prototypes win. Sometimes the noise is too high to the signal. Sometimes they sort of like trick you into thinking something's good and it falls apart in your hand. And if it's been going too long and you've had too many lumps, sometimes like the team's capacity to ask questions starts eroding faster than you think. And then people start panicking. Like suddenly people start prematurely committing. They start upscoping. They start downscoping. They're like, we need to tear everything down and go back to the hypothesis. That's normal. And I think a lot of people don't think it's normal. They end up sort of looking in the mirror and panicking, thinking that it's just them. Like most the people that I know that like have gone through this, where you're like, yeah, man, like prototyping, super high stakes. The signal noise to noise ratio is really messed up, and you need help, and you need to be talking to your producer, talking to your leads, talking to your business folks. To be honest, yeah,
Yeah. I love how you include that into where at this leadership layer there's sort of there is a accountability that's being held between the leaders around an ongoing conversation around like, hey, have we done enough? Is this good enough? Have we gotten too far? Have we gone not far? Like all this different, did that answer the question? And I also want to just reflect too, not in this podcast, but previously, you've talked a lot about this idea of architecture. And I think after this conversation, I have a much better understanding of what you mean when it comes to I'm trying to set up. Like a lot of this phase it's not just about the game. It is also about the team. It's about bringing those things together and creating the lab that will maximize our chances once we do pull the trigger on something of creating something. And I loved what you said. We're going to spend this time, whether it's a year, 6 months, 3 years, because we're going to spend this time immersing ourselves and deeply understanding the space. It will pay off. It doesn't pay off right now. It pays off when we're in production. And when we hit a weird question and we hit this strange edge case that actually becomes way more common than we thought it would be in terms of how players are interacting with something, and we have to make a change. And now the fact that we did that work and those people are still here, there are still like lead designers that were present for that phase. They are able to take those lessons and bring them forward and say, hey, based on what I remember of how we attacked this space before and the knowledge that I have and have been hopefully sharing throughout the team, path X is better than path Y for us to try to solve this. And to be able to do that with, obviously still curiosity, still openness to it being wrong, but with some confidence that we understand this. Like it's again, it's given me more depth to that idea of you're crafting so much more than just a prototype, so much more than just a game as you're doing this. If you want to like build even one game well, you have to think through all of this. And it again, it's like games are hard, video games are hard, but they're not impossible. And so anyway, yeah, no, this has been really cool. So just rambled on for a bit there. I wanted to come back. That original question was, hey, you get a prototype, you put it in front of players, make contact with reality as soon as you can. You were saying, I think there's more depth I want to add to that. I think you have added a lot of depth to that. And a lot of it's through that lens of who is your team? What do they understand? How much do you know? How well, again, I don't know if this is how you'd say it, but it's almost like how well can you predict what's going to happen when things change? Because the better you're able to do that, the better I can trust your understanding of the space. Are there any other things that you've thought about as like techniques, tactics, whatever, that leaders could be applying to, again, get that understanding of, hey, this is a good game or it's not?
Yeah, I think the big one that comes to mind is World of Warcraft was built by a bunch of EverQuest nerds. And World of Warcraft, in my opinion, I'm sure that someone might correct me out there, did not have one single thing that made it great. It didn't have that single innovation. That's like if you had pitched World of Warcraft, it's actually not that interesting of a pitch. Be like it's like EverQuest, but a slightly more accessible and skinned in this beloved RTS's world. And before it came out, I think a lot of World of Warcraft people, or like a lot of critics, were basically like, World of Warcraft is going to bomb. It's meaningless. People underestimated how many genre micro innovations that they could sort of build through sheer just grasp of a new space. And I feel a little bit similarly with League of Legends, which is it's not just that there's like an underserved audience, it's that there was enough friction points and sort of little things that sort of in aggregate sort of add up. And that
Yeah.
often when we're sort of talking about what makes these games fun, people underestimate like how many little rough underpolished edges that matter exist in some of the best games. Like one of my favorite examples is for Apex Legends, they built a ping system. And the ping system was massively well received. It's like, oh my God, you got to check out every game needs one of these now. I'd consider it like a pretty decent innovation. Like, I don't know for certain, but I bet you $10 right now that like that didn't start from like this is how we sort of like make a better battle royale. That sort of teams have sort of variable capacity for sort of these improvements, and often they spend all their gas trying to sort of land the singular marketing friendly massive plus one, and kind of miss these other opportunities to sort of rack up a bunch of smaller wins that sort of one or two of them might pop off and actually be really meaningful. And that's often because there's you want a critical mass of sort of passion and literacy of the space. That as much as I appreciate devs being creatively ambitious and trying to like move on to other genres or sort of take jobs in genres that don't really speak to them, like, I mean, I'm not as, militant as Riot was at certain times of sort of how much this matters, but like I was surprised for a while there that Riot was so intense about people that really understood League. And I do feel like when you're trying to build something new in a space, it's easy to sort of like underestimate the value of sort of like the micro improvements, underestimate the value of devs that really care about sort of small things that sort of bother them in their favorite hobby. Like, I think it's one of the reasons that World of Warcraft has been on top of its genre for so long is because it was birthed from a place that cared so much about sort of these little quality of life issues and sort of kept iterating and sort of kept getting after them. Like, don't be surprised if you can sort of farm a significant improvement to a genre just by sort of pulling those threads. But that only matters if you're sort of budgeted and structured in such a way to leave room for that. If you scramble, like your devs are not going to be like, hey, remember this minor pain point. And it's often a lot of the like quiet quality of your game is sort of found in those little corners and edges. And it's like getting the team to internalize that they matter and that sort of players care and that sort of we are moving the ball is sometimes hard when you keep sort of pointing at your pillars and your pitch as sort of like the end all be all of razors as to sort of how you compete and sort of how do you get in there. My last little bit on this is like one of the reasons like I have like a bit of a pain point when people use sort of minimum viable product. I like it. It's a valuable term. It's a valuable concept. The thing is in video games, it's just a hair different because in a lot of ways, the critical difference between like technology products and games is technology problems, like products often objectively solve a problem for you and you're happy if it just hits that checkbox. Video games in some ways are closer to like luxury goods. And if you buy a luxury car, when you open up that car handle and it feels a little wobbly and it feels a little off, it ruins the spell. It sort of breaks your impression that this is something of quality that was loved. And it's often those micro innovations and those little, being mindful of the smaller areas of sort of friction or quality of life. You'd be surprised how powerful that might be to sort of somebody that sort of spent 10 years in a genre and they've had that sort of rock in their shoe for 10 years and you fix it. That's somebody that's telling their friends that, you're a game that matters, that you have credibility. So
Yeah.
it's a difficult cocktail, sort of, prioritizing the sort of the big and the small, but like leaving breathing room to sort of like help the small is a surprising sort of organizational feat, because typically it's every ounce of effort and attention just to get the game shipped with one or two big things that make it different. If you can find room for those little ones, man, those things can really push. Yeah, I've got
I
more,
love
but
that.
that was the one that was top of mind.
No, it's well. Are there any other one? Because a couple of thoughts came to mind for me, and one of them related to size of team, things like that, and I know we've talked about this before, again, not on the podcast, but that idea of when you're thinking about budgeting, you're thinking about setting yourself up and thinking about your runway, and you're going to run all these prototypes.
Yeah.
The more expensive that
So
is.
you're right.
Um,
I definitely want to talk about this one because I've learned
okay.
this one a couple different ways. Like, um, you know, being really conscious of your upstream versus your downstream is so hard and important.
Talk more. Define those terms
So
for us.
upstream, in my opinion, is the chain. In my mind, feel free to disagree with, is
Yeah.
business, then game direction, then engineering, then design, then most of the aesthetic disciplines, with animation being on top. You know, test not last. Don't assume last. Test appears at sort of odd places in there, and that if the business doesn't have a portfolio strategy, the game director cannot pitch. If the game director doesn't have a pitch, engineering can't make technology investments to unblock design. Like the chain is really critical, and I think there's a desire, a common desire, to try to do things in parallel, to see reach a critical mass of team where you have both upstream and downstream devs next to each other, so they can better inform each other, so the dependencies can be identified, so better some more, like the dream is better cement can be poured because we have the actual people on staff who are going to be making the actual decisions. And in reality, I've come to believe it's way more practical in most circumstances to keep it small. If you can avoid even hiring designers, if your game director can hire one designer enough to sort of like get engineering the time and space it needs to pour cement, in my opinion, engineering is like does not receive enough time to really do what it needs to do in almost every project I've ever seen. And that
100% agree.
like like
100% agree.
like
Yeah.
engineering will be a trooper and say yes to juggling too many plates, but like you're robbing your long term, like you're like small differences in tech stack quality can make or break your project. They can pay a massive tax on all your content forever. Plus, like your engineers stretch thin between trying to force multiply other devs while sort of getting their sort of house in order is bad. And on a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, like I think it's going to become more modern to try to supplement your small engineering and design centric team with freelance art, with freelance, spot support of specialists before you hire FTEs to protect your burn. It's not easy, but I think
Yep.
it's a superior model than to eat the FTEs. There's exceptions. Some genres, you need narrative in there early. Some genres,
Yep.
animation
Yep.
will kill you if you do not pull
Yeah.
animation in
If you're
soon.
making Witcher 4, you probably need to bring narrative in right off the bat.
But
Yeah.
I think overhiring engineering and giving them a little bit too much time should be the new baseline. And
Yeah.
like if design proves to you that they have a very nice prototyping trajectory, for me that's the burden to sort of look at your staffing plan. Until you are certain that your design team actually has the momentum you hope they do, it's dubious to basically assume design's going to be able to answer questions sufficiently. There's a real chance that you need to go back to your thesis, go back to your reference, go back to your business partners and sort of have a tough talk because prototyping is not bearing fruit. And if you're overstaffed, you're just going to like die. You're going to push your design team to answer
Yeah.
questions to save your bacon instead of doing the right thing and going back to drawing board and thinking critically about what you have. In the meantime, those engineering hires you're probably going to end up in the same genre, and it's very unlikely that you're going to be rewriting major IP agnostic tech. So it's good investment to get the engineers in there early enough and give them breathing room. I feel like the aesthetic disciplines, like as much as I like having them as partners and how like it's inspiring to have them early, that burn is so scary. It's really like if you start doing math of sort of even a couple extra aesthetic disciplines versus sort of spot freelance support, like if you're utterly confident in your team's ability to prove something in a small time box for some reason, I could see it. But if you're not sure, you're just better off as a leader, sort of assuming that your upstream teams can't sort of deliver ever so predictably that your downstream teams are sort of unblocked from hiring. It's an easy mistake to make. I get it, and it's more inspiring when, especially when you have your magic art director friend that sort of is the best in the world, and you can't wait to hire them. But like having them blocked or semi-blocked is like they're like, oh, I won't be a bother. Trust me. It's like, dude, it's also the burn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Anything else? Anything else come to mind when you think about this space? Any other tips, tricks, things that you would want leaders in game dev to know?
So there's one more that's a little experimental, but like I liked it. It worked for me pretty well. I have a thing I like calling prototype series that maybe somebody else invented and I just accidentally reinvented and sort of named it the same thing. But um, as a leader and as especially as a producer, I think there is a desire to get in and try to do tracking and planning on individual bits of exploration, be it concept or technology or especially design. And while that can have some value, I feel like when uncertainty is high, you're better off structuring the work as basically um, a targeted batch that you have X number of prototypes string together that are all revolving around a similar question or a similar line of investigation. That has a couple of advantages. One is if you build a prototype series, it's a lot easier for engineers to support that because they can kind of get a sense of the chunk of exploration and kind of what are the technology needs and sort of how to feed it. The other advantage is you don't have to sort of really deal as much of the whiplash of sort of prototypes, individual prototypes within that series being spun up and spun down. And you can, like you don't want to have to sort of recalibrate the team every time a prototype runs into a wall and you have to sort of, rethink it. It's good to sort of have a bigger box of prototype series that sort of gives you a little bit more room to play. The other advantage is I think it puts you in a better mindset to be disciplined as to sort of what do we expect, what are the major questions in play, what are the constraints, what's the time box for the prototype series, as opposed to an individual prototype where suddenly you're spending too much time looking at trees instead of sort of the forest, as to sort of like, hey, a prototype series should take a couple of weeks and it's roughly a topic and we should be able to sort of post-mortem it and sort of debrief sort of learnings from it. And as a producer, it's a lot easier to hold the team's feet to the fire in a healthy way, making sure that we're using a prototype series efficiently and that when we wind it down, we sort of expect it to have meaningful answers. I think it's a better tool. And, not all prototype series will bear fruit, but like, I do feel like if they're structured well, it's much more likely that you can feel confident that you're advancing the project month over month or quarter over quarter with that tool than sort of like a random grab bag of prototypes that are running in all directions and that you yourself are losing the thread as to sort of what questions are really in play. Having too many variables moving at the same time when you're trying to answer questions is bad science.
Yeah, yeah.
Intentionally freezing some variables and selecting some variables to sort of really dig in on while you leave the rest, frozen might feel a little strange for the team because they're like, well, what if I just want to touch that variable? You're like, well, let's just be disciplined as a team, run a prototype series with these variables. And if for some reason you really need to hit the brakes and put up a hand and say, well, I actually really, really want to touch that thing outside the constraints of the prototype series, it's a conversation. We don't have to be, crazy. It's like, it's like a sprint.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
no rule that says like, oh no, we can't question it at any point in time. I think in general, the size of the batches of work is a really difficult to wrap your head around for a lot of leaders because they're used to one altitude. And that altitude is either I trust my team, I let them do whatever they want, or we're looking at sort of multi-day batches of work or single tasks, and that's where people feel
Yeah.
comfortable being leaders from. And when you're dealing with sort of exploration structures, I feel like looking at sort of weeks of work, or it varies per genre. You're better off. Like, I know there's a lot of people that love 2 weeks because it's like magic for a lot of reasons. And I'm like, you should sort of open yourself up to like varying that number based off the nature of the work. And don't be surprised that like, unleashing a concept artist for a 4 week batch is more efficient than trying to split that into two, because they're like, really, it's the same flavor of exploration. And like, it might be 3 weeks, it might be one. I think it's only later in the project that it's sort of like finding your work batches, sort of start getting a little bit more stable and standardized, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Canonize that when that happens, but yeah,
I think yeah, it's a thing that too that I would say that when scale starts to happen, you there are. I'm always torn on this because I like highly flexible iteration lengths. So like if your team wants to run twice a day and your team wants to run every 2 weeks, I'm like, that's fine. But I also get that at scale, some amount of like, hey, we there's a rhythm that we can establish to development, and that rhythm is helpful for us in predictability. I wish people picked a week instead of 2 weeks, generally speaking, but fair enough. I lost that one before I even got into it. So, yeah, I broadly what you're describing, I'm
yeah.
huge fan of. Like that's how you said it too, is understand the uncertainty of the system and build your iteration length around that. Be comfortable with where that is or
Yeah, I
isn't.
think there's a very good fundamental reason for that, which is the thing I said earlier, which is often explorations need to be evaluated as a set, not as individuals. You're giving
Mm-hmm.
notes on individual explorations. You're talking about it, but as far as decisively coming to sort of like committed to conclusions, it's more of it's more of a set question, and you're not going to develop often a meaningful set that's worthy of real, serious evaluation if the batches are too short. You end up sort of
Yeah.
you end up analyzing the trees, and you never have the forest conversation because your batches weren't big enough. So,
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's where too you have different types of iterations. There's like a local work iteration, like something like a sprint, and then you might have like I'd almost say that something that you're describing in the prototype series is, hey, maybe a series takes 6 weeks, and we're going to do a whole ton of prototypes in a 6 week window, depending on number of people and what you're trying to get done, and then we're going to evaluate those prototypes and see, and then we're going to switch the variables we're playing with, and we're going to like set some different conditions for this one, like, hey, run another 6 weeks. I want to give you an opportunity, Leif. Anything you want to plug before we wrap?
a plug. I did start a new
Yeah.
game company, but it's secret. So I'll
Okay.
soft plug it. I am,
There you go.
yeah. I've been posting on LinkedIn a little more if people want to follow me. I've been trying to sort of,
Yeah.
I don't think I've done mine today, but I was going to do every Monday. Not that I need follows, but just in case people want to.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Folks should check it out. All right. With that, we will wrap it up. So until next time, thanks all for listening. Thank you, Leif, so much for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. That was awesome.
Cool. Thanks, man.
All right. Cheers. All right. I want to summarize what we just covered. There were a lot of good points in this one. I cut it down to 12, and I cut several others that were really good, but credit to Leif. I think he killed it. So let's go through them. First, number one, do your homework. Making a new game isn't just thinking of a cool idea, it's understanding the other supposedly cool ideas that have succeeded and failed in the space. Do you know your genre, or are you just taking wild guesses? Study before and as you build. 2. Do not overcommit to your initial idea. If you commit budget and tooling to support one vision, you limit your ability to pivot, react to feedback, and change as you learn. Your first idea may work, but if it doesn't, you want to be ready to adjust. You are building the lab that can take on questions in unknown spaces and find answers, not the factory that produces the single game you thought you wanted at the start. 3. You learn immense amounts from failed prototypes. They inform your lab, your designers, everyone, and they help you later on when you run into problems. Don't rush to a few high-stakes prototypes. Your objective at the start is to learn, and even to learn how to learn. Do not fall in love with your early prototypes. They were only there to teach lessons. 4. The best prototypes are often not good, they are provocative. Use them to understand the limits and excesses of your space. You want to build a map first, then try to get somewhere. Otherwise, you won't know where you are. 5. The effectiveness of your team at operating well together to work through problems and improve themselves is more important than how well you plan out your path to first playable. It is the team and their understanding that will save you later, not receiving a bunch of early player feedback you don't understand. 6. Counterintuitively, quantity of exploration and lessons learned is more important than quality. Prioritize speed. Push back against the early desire to make things shippable so they seem to look and play better. You're slowing yourself down too much early on. 7. The last half of your development cycle will either be assisted by all the lessons you learned in the first half or be a broken mess as you learn them all too late. 8. With all that we've just said, you need a counterbalance to avoid running off and prototyping forever. Err on the side of shutting down prototyping too soon rather than too late. Don't explore every conceivable option. When you start predicting what will happen too frequently, don't spend more time in that space. You want to be a little scared to move forward. You don't want to be terrified. And experience will help here. 9. A better game isn't always about a singular innovation that makes the experience better. It can be about many micro innovations that, once experienced, the players just can't do without. Don't miss the little wins trying to nail what you hoped would be the defining moment or feature of your game. Your players will tell you what your defining features are if you succeed. 10. Engineers never get enough time to set up the foundations of the game. They're willing to go forward, telling you how they'll get it done, but too often they get undercut from a time perspective. Everything is built on code, and even if you're using a third-party engine, you will likely need to make lots of changes to make your game the right way. Rush them at your peril. 11. Scaling early should be seen as very scary. The burn rate is real, and you will die. 12. As leaders, don't be stuck at either 30,000 feet or completely in the weeds. Lead at the level that matches the uncertainty in the space. Sometimes that will not fit any neat box or tool you happen to have available. That's okay. Learn a new one. Okay, as I said, there were more I could have hit, but I hope that's good for now. Thanks for listening.